In video 2 for Unit 7, we're going to be looking at how the Great War impacted the United States. We now call this World War One. When World War One first started, the United States really wasn't involved. The issues that led to the war really were European issues. So the goal of the United States was to stay neutral. As a matter of fact, the president for us during World War One, a man named Woodrow Wilson, asked Congress for a declaration of neutrality. That might remind you of the Declaration of Neutrality that George Washington established all the way back as our first president. So Wilson's trying to follow that example of staying neutral when at all possible. However, a series of events, some of which we're going to look at in just a moment, led the United States closer and closer to joining the war until eventually we actually did join into World War One. The issue that probably upset the American people the most had to do with submarines, or what the Germans called U-boats. The most infamous example of this was the Lusitania. The Lusitania was a passenger ship, not from the same company as the Titanic, but as you look at this image, they're very similar, large passenger ships, and it was actually hit by a German U-boat. Now, this was really surprising at the time because it was pretty much standard practice of all nations to try to avoid civilian deaths if at all possible in warfare. But this changed everything when the Germans attacked this passenger ship, the Lusitania. Now, this is a British ship, so most of the people that passed away on the ship were British, but about 130 Americans died on this as well. And so this made Americans very upset at Germany. However, as the war continues to go on, Germany's get starts to get a little more desperate, and they start this policy called unrestricted submarine warfare, which basically meant that they would attack any ships that they thought could be helping their enemies. This included neutral ships like American merchant ships. So the Lusitania is the most famous example, but unrestricted submarine warfare was a consistent policy by the Germans of attacking many, many, many ships. And again, every ship that sank made the United States more and more upset. As we get closer to entering the war, Germany tried to set up a deal with Mexico. In this cartoon you see to the right, the temptation, Germany is trying to get Mexico to ally with them, with Germany, by promising them if they would attack the United States, if in fact the United States joined World War One, that Germany would help Mexico get back some of the land that it lost as part of the Mexican American War all the way back in the 1840s. Now, Mexico never agreed to this. We discovered this telegram before Mexico really even had a chance to, even if they would have, probably not. But the point was that Germany was actively trying to get nations to ally with them against the United States, and obviously we could not ignore this. And not too long after the Zimmerman telegram and the resumption of unrestricted submarine warfare, the United States actually declared war on Germany and joined World War One. So, what were the key events and issues that moved the United States away from neutrality to us actually getting involved in World War One? Some of the impacts that World War One had on the United States included something that has become known as the Great Migration. A lot of jobs were opened up in northern factories for two reasons. Number one, you obviously had soldiers going overseas to fight that would have been filling those jobs. But there's also a need for a lot of war materials during World War One. Now, there was such a need for work that jobs were even offered to groups that had been denied those jobs before, like women and blacks. Matter of fact, a large number of blacks from the South decided to move up north for these jobs during World War One. Now, the jobs were a big reason that they moved up north, the main reason, but also there's no Jim Crow established in northern cities. Doesn't mean that there wasn't racism, but the established policy of segregation with Jim Crow did not exist in places like Chicago or New York. So again, the Great Migration is this period of history when blacks from the South move in large numbers, mainly to northern cities, looking for job opportunities. So, what was the Great Migration, and why did people choose to move during this period? A law that was passed with good intentions during World War I was the Espionage Act. It was meant to protect Americans against people that were doing things that could have harmed us, like spying and being traitors to the country. However, as the war continued to go on, the Espionage Act was changed, and it became more and more harsh to the point that people could be imprisoned or fined for speaking out against the war, doing anything that could be perceived as hurting the war. Now, the problem with this is we have the First Amendment. And the First Amendment obviously gives us the freedom of speech, the freedom of press, the right to petition the government. A lot of our key rights are found in that First Amendment. And the Espionage Act, many people believed, went against the First Amendment and denied people their rights of freedom of expression. One person that became a target of the government under the Espionage Act was Eugene V. Debs. He was arrested for some speeches that he gave that spoke out against the war. However, as a socialist leader, he already was disliked by many people and distrusted by many people because most Americans looked down on socialism at that time. Some people believe, and it may be true, that Debs was unfairly imprisoned under the Espionage Act, not just because of what he said, but because of his political views as a socialist. So, what was the Espionage Act and why was it controversial? And who was Eugene V. Debs and why was he put in prison? When the war came to an end, President Wilson came up with what he called his 14 points plan. These were 14 different ideas about how to try to prevent future wars like World War I from happening. The main point, number 14 of the 14 points he came up with, was what he called the League of Nations. This was an international peacekeeping body that was put together in an attempt to try to solve issues before they led to things like big wars again. Now, President Wilson was very excited about the League of Nations, and many other countries also agreed to join it. However, in the United States, isolationism was starting to take hold. Isolationism is a belief that a country, in our case, the United States, should stay out of world affairs. So, in our country, the way the checks and balances and separation of powers work is that a president comes up with treaties, but then the United States Senate actually has to approve those treaties. If you look at this cartoon on the right, many people in America agreed with this cartoon. This is a cartoon from somebody who was against us joining the League of Nations. They thought that, as you see Uncle Sam here being kind of tied up in knots, that us getting involved in things like the League of Nations would actually pull us into problems of other countries and drag us into things that we could stay out of. Woodrow Wilson thought the League of Nations would be a tool for the United States to be involved to try to keep problems from happening. But ultimately, when the United States Senate voted, the isolationist point of view won out, and the United States Senate refused to allow the United States to join the League of Nations. So, what was the goal of Woodrow Wilson's 14 points? What was the League of Nations? And why did the United States Senate refuse to allow the United States to join the League of Nations?